Okay, so on to Andrew's videos on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. At this point I'm convinced that Andrew is going off of a script someone gave him. A very bad script that Andrew accepted on good faith. But who knows? In any case, I think this is why larger right-wing YouTube creators avoid diving into tax policy and economic history. The data clearly shows that tax and economic policy in this country has moved far to the right, and that this has resulted in massive income inequality. So, most creators on the right avoid actually touching the topic of tax rates and mostly stick to complaining about social justice warriors. When they do discuss taxes, it's generally limited to rhetorical games and platitudes that have little to no relationship with reality. Andrew likes to point out Ocasio-Cortez's numerous gaffes, and there's no denying that she is a gaffe machine. The reason no one outside right-wing circles really cares about this is because she's a congressional freshman who hasn't even reached 30, and we're living in a time where the person with the nuclear codes has the attention span, patience, impulse control and temperament of a syphilitic rattlesnake. He also lacks the ability to form a coherent sentence, and he even thinks the F-35 is literally invisible.
The leading woman's business executive in this country, according to many. And we buy billions and billions of dollars worth of that beautiful F-35. It's stealth. You cannot see it. Is that correct? Better be correct, right?
Of course, Andrew doesn't focus on these things because he is obviously catering to a right-wing audience. So here is Ocasio-Cortez explaining that a 70% top marginal tax rate, meaning the amount that's taxed on every dollar past a certain threshold, in this case, every dollar past $10 million, isn't so extreme given that historically speaking, this tax rate was 70% or higher.
This kind of tax rate was the norm up until the early 80s.
It was. This is not a new idea. Under Republican administration, Dwight Eisenhower, we had 90% marginal tax rates.
Wow.
First off, you can't compare current federal tax rates to what they were 60 plus years ago. The tax code was completely different.
Yes, Andrew, we can compare the top marginal tax rates to before because the fundamentals of income and taxes haven't changed. So we can absolutely compare and note how much higher top marginal tax rates were on the wealthy, on corporations, and how much higher our rate of unionization was back when America was great. We can note how this increase in all three coincides with the creation of the American middle class, and we can note that their dismantling coincides with the destruction of the middle class. We can also compare the United States to other advanced OECD nations and note how middle classes are still intact in advanced nations that haven't implemented the trickle-down economics scam that's simply shifted all of the economic gains to the top.
And without getting too much into it, no one really paid the top rate of 91%.
Correct, the top marginal effective tax rates were lower than the statutory tax rates then, just as they are now. But the wealthy were still paying more in taxes than they are now. That's the point. Even with their ability to lower their tax exposure, they still end up paying a percentage of that statutory rate, just not the entire amount. And yet in addressing how much the wealthy would pay now with a top marginal tax rate of 70%, you still factor in and assume they'd be paying that entire 70% now, which they wouldn't. Last but not least, it's important to note that part of the reason these statutory rates aren't entirely paid is that some of that money is spent back into the economy and written off as an expenditure. And indeed, we do see that the rate of GDP growth was noticeably higher during this period of high tax rates on the wealthy and on corporations, back when America was great.
Second, Eisenhower didn't implement those high tax rates. They had been in place since 1943 when FDR was president.
Which goes to show you how far to the right our economic policy has shifted. During this time of America being great, we had accepted high taxes on the wealthy and on corporations and strong labor protections as a means for maintaining a strong middle class that wasn't living paycheck to paycheck.
Under Republican administration, Dwight Eisenhower, we had 90%.
And under a Republican administration, under Ronald Reagan, the top tax rate was lowered to 38.5%.
Exactly. It wasn't until the implementation of trickle-down economics that we see this rightward shift in economic policy. What have lower taxes on the wealthy and on corporations and a war on unions gotten us? An economy that's funneled all of the added gains of a growing GDP to the top 1% and a struggling middle class that's barely getting by as their paychecks have fallen behind rising costs of living.
Washington Post. While the 70% top tax rate might bring in an additional $720 billion over 10 years, it wouldn't come close to funding these things. Single-payer healthcare alone would come in at a cost of at least $32.6 trillion.
But our current healthcare costs will amount to $36 trillion over the same time period. That's $4 trillion more than Medicare for all once you account for private and public expenditures. We would simply shift private sector premiums to a public sector premium, or a tax if you will. The tax will be less and everyone will be covered.
Raised our corporate tax rate to 28%, which is not even as high as it was before.
Right.
The federal corporate tax rate in the US before Trump's tax cut was 35%, the highest in the entire world. But thanks to the tax cuts, it's now at 21%.
Okay, so a quick history lesson. Back when America was great, the top marginal statutory tax rate for corporations was 50%, and since the 80s, it's been 35%. Trump has recently lowered that rate to 21%. Note I said statutory tax rate, because that's not what corporations actually pay. Their effective tax rate is much lower, and in fact, American corporations, who by the way have been doing business in the most lucrative market on the planet, were already paying well below the OECD average. Sometimes, as is the case with Amazon, American corporations actually pay zero in federal taxes. And this is to say nothing of the value-added tax, which most of these other countries have.
And since companies can afford to invest in new workers, US unemployment is at the lowest in history.
You mean the economy has continued along the same trajectory it was already on when these tax cuts were implemented? But here is a trajectory that did change. The budget deficit has grown at an even faster rate than expected thanks to Trump's tax cuts on corporations. So once again, we see the same pattern from the Republican Party. They keep cutting taxes on corporations and on the wealthy, and keep claiming there is no way to pay for the basic services that other advanced OECD nations enjoy. They keep funneling the wealth to the top 1% and convincing the person struggling at $40,000 per year that the source of his problems are the people only making $20,000 per year. Oh, and as taxes on corporations have been slashed, much of the slack has been picked up by middle and even lower income earners through the highly regressive payroll taxes. But on the bright side, corporate profits continue to climb, even as most Americans see their wages fall behind rising costs of living. Part of the challenge in addressing videos like this goes well beyond just addressing facts. There's an underlying assumption people tend to have over how and even why taxes work in an interdependent society like ours. So I'm going to include an interview with David Pakman where he unpacks some misconceptions and explains them properly. Notice how he sounds more like a scientist or a professor discussing this topic, and contrast this to the salesman or lawyer-like vibe you get when hearing right-wing content creators discussing this topic.
When we lower the tax rate on corporations from, I believe it was 35% up until 2017, under the Trump Republican tax reform plan, the business corporate tax rate went down to 21%. The country as a whole still needs the same amount of money and more to fund what we're doing, which is why the deficit continues to grow. So when you get less of that money from corporations, it's coming from somewhere else. Someone else is going to have to pay for that. That's already a redistribution. So it's really important not to think about this issue as, is it fair to go from no redistribution to redistribution? Because that's not the status quo. What we want to be thinking about is, What redistributions are happening right now? What are we saying when we allow companies, for example, like Amazon, to pay no taxes and someone else is paying for that, compared to, well, maybe let's make them pay their fair share. Maybe let's make the very, very rich pay their fair share. It's already being redistributed. The question is, how do we want to do it? That's really important to understand.
And so what about the argument that the more money that corporations, say like Amazon, keep, then the more that they can, the more jobs they can offer, the more, the higher maybe they can raise their wages.
Sure.
Things like that.
These are all very old and very tired arguments from what's called supply-side economics mostly. Some people call it Reaganomics, some people call it voodoo economics. It's basically bogus, and we can take each piece one at a time if you want.
Sure.
When we look, for example, at the 2017 Trump tax reform, businesses got a tax cut, like we just said, 35% down to 21%. It was sold to us as businesses are going to go crazy investing in themselves. Everybody's going to make more money. Wages are going to go up. It's going to be just so great. It'll all pay for itself. Obviously, it hasn't paid for itself. Deficit is record high. But what businesses did with the money was disproportionately just go and repurchase shares of their own stock. Who is that good for? Well, it raises the price of the stock. So the people who own most of the stock are the ones that benefit. That is disproportionately very rich people, hedge funds, etc., and executives at those corporations. So the idea that if as a business you get a tax cut, you're going to go hire more people makes no sense, because businesses hire based on demand primarily. And they have much more immediately positive ways to self-enrich that they would use those tax cuts. My business is an example. I mean, as a result of the Trump tax reform plan, my business is an S corporation, which means that the income it passes through to the shareholders. I'm one of those shareholders. Even though my business grew from 2017 to 2018 pretty significantly, my effective tax rate went from 26% to 22%. So the question is not, do I like keeping more of my money? Sure, right? I mean, in a vacuum, I'd love to keep 100% of my money. The question is economically, societally, what makes sense and what should be done with that. I don't go and hire more people because my effective tax rate went down. I would hire more people if there's demand for the product and service that I'm offering that justifies hiring more people. If you're Amazon and you get a huge tax break or a huge tax refund, that doesn't make more people want your stuff. That's why you would go and hire more people. So that's one example. And if there's others you want to go through, we can go through them.
No, I think
those are all like supply side arguments that are very widely debunked.
But on that argument of, but maybe not hiring people, but would you consider expanding your business in any way? Maybe better equipment or, I don't know, bigger studio,
Sure.
anything like that?
Here's what's fascinating about that. A higher tax rate would incentivize me to do that more than a lower tax rate.
Why is that?
I'm going to try to explain this as simply as possible. If the tax rate is 30%, so let's back up even a second. It's really important to understand that business expenses are tax deductible. So if your business makes $100,000 and spends $50,000 on wages and equipment, whatever, you're paying taxes on the $50,000 that's left over. So when you spend money, you avoid taxes. If I spend another $100 as a business owner, that's $100 I'm not going to pay taxes on. What makes more sense as an incentive? For me to spend money to avoid a 30% tax, or for me to spend money to avoid a 20% tax?
Well,
I'm incentivized to avoid a higher tax rate. So very interestingly, this is one of the most widely circulated bogus talking points about supply-side economics. The incentive to invest in your own business to avoid taxes is higher when the tax rate is higher. Now, there's a limit to this, because I know that there will be supply-siders who will say, David, hold on. That doesn't work for like a 95% tax rate. You would just stop working. That's correct. All of these things exist within a normal spectrum, right? So nobody's talking about a 95% tax rate on businesses, but you are more incentivized to avoid a higher rate of tax by investing in your business.
so then so that's interesting. All right.
Your reaction, the look on your face is really important, because I have this conversation all the time with people and I see the wheels turning and people go, that's right, that I would rather avoid a 30% tax than a 20% tax. The 20% tax might make me say, I'll just pay the 20% and pull my
Right,
profit.
and I'm not really pushing back. I'm really just trying to, because you're the first person we've had on to really dig deep into the details of social democracy.
This is why it's
So
important to
is
talk about this
interesting.
stuff, because so many of these things, a talking point gets circulated and it gets repeated, sometimes for 30 years, 40 years. And only when you really start thinking about it can you start to kind of pull it apart and have these conversations. And what's really important is I have this conversation with people who very strongly push back against what I'm saying. But I have that conversation in a way that is respectful, it's polite. I'm genuinely seeking to find the truth about this stuff. And if someone came to me and said, no, here's what you're forgetting, David, when you make that explanation, I would say, that's really interesting. I'm going to go research that, because I actually want to understand the truth of these issues. And I think that there's a lot to be gained by really trying to pull them apart in this way.
Gotcha. So okay. So we've had on quite a